The letter landed on the desk between them like a loaded gun, and for a moment, Sheriff Isaac Ingram could not bring himself to look at Helena Langley's face. He had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in the hollow dark of sleepless nights. He had imagined himself composed, professional, a man of duty standing before a woman who meant everything to him, and choosing the right thing with steady hands and clear eyes. But now that the moment had arrived, with the afternoon sun burning through the dusty window of the Harlow Creek jailhouse, and the smell of her lavender soap cutting through the gunpowder and leather that usually ruled this room, Isaac found that every rehearsed word had turned to ash in his mouth. "You are leaving," Helena said. It was not a question. Her voice was low, controlled in that way she had when she was keeping something terrible from escaping. "Helena, do not." She pressed her fingers flat against the worn wood of his desk, and he watched the color drain from her knuckles. "Do not say my name like that, like you are already apologizing, like this is already decided." Isaac looked at the letter then. The official seal of the United States Marshal's Office, Denver Division, pressed in deep red wax that had cracked slightly in the heat of the noon ride. He had read it 4 times since it arrived that morning. He could recite it by memory. Senior Marshal, Denver, twice the salary. A real future. A city with proper streets and a courthouse and law that did not depend on one man's reputation and the fear he generated just by walking into a saloon. "They are offering me senior marshal," he said. "Denver. It is the kind of appointment men spend their whole careers working toward." "I know what it is," Helena said. "I can read." He had forgotten, for just a moment, that she had been the one to bring the letter from the post office, that she had carried it across the street with its official seal already making her stomach sick before she even handed it to him. "Then, you know, I have to at least consider it." "Consider it," she repeated, and there was something in those 2 words that broke open like a wound. "Isaac, if you consider it for 1 more second, you are going to talk yourself into leaving this town and everything in it. And you know it. And I know it. And the only reason we are having this conversation at all is because somewhere in that stubborn, honorable chest of yours, you do not actually want to go." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Isaac had ever heard. He had arrived in Harlow Creek, New Mexico Territory in the spring of 1882, a man running from something he could never quite name. Not the law, not debt, something quieter and more corrosive than that. He had arrived trailing a reputation from his 3 years as deputy sheriff in Tucson, where he had broken up the Caldwell smuggling ring and put 6 dangerous men behind bars. The town council of Harlow Creek had hired him by letter before he ever set foot on their soil, and when the stagecoach rolled him in on a Tuesday morning with nothing but a saddlebag and his grandfather's Colt single-action Army revolver on his hip, he had expected to find a rough little outpost, barely holding itself together at the seams. He had not expected Helena Langley. She had been standing outside the general store she owned with her father when the stage arrived, a clipboard in her hand and ink on her fingers, arguing with a supply driver about the weight discrepancy, in a barrel of flour with the kind of quiet ferocity that made the driver visibly wish he had chosen a different profession. She was 24 years old, with dark hair pinned up in the stern, practical fashion of a woman who had no patience for ornamentation, and a pair of gray eyes that seemed to be measuring everything they landed on, including the new sheriff stepping down from the stagecoach with road dust on his coat and a careful expression on his face. Their eyes had met for approximately 3 seconds before Helena went back to arguing about the flour barrel, and Isaac had told himself that the strange heat in his chest was simply the New Mexico sun. He had been lying to himself ever since. Isaac had been 28 then, young for the weight of a sheriff's star, old enough to recognize that the town of Harlow Creek needed more than just a quick hand and a hard reputation. It needed consistency. It needed justice administered with patience and intelligence as much as force. It needed someone who would stay. He had stayed. 3 years he had stayed, and in those 3 years Harlow Creek had grown from a struggling collection of buildings into something that genuinely deserved to be called a town. He had done that partly with his fists and his revolver, and partly with his stubborn, exhausting insistence on treating every complaint, every dispute, every frightened widow and cheated merchant with the full weight of his attention. He had ridden out after cattle thieves and brought them back alive when he could. He had mediated land disputes between ranchers and farmers when the rest of New Mexico territory was letting those disputes explode into blood feuds. He had built a jail that was clean and a courthouse that was fair and a reputation that meant the worst men in the territory thought twice about making Harlow Creek their business. And through all of it, slowly, in the way that only happens when two proud people are too frightened to say what they mean, he had fallen completely and irrevocably in love with Helena Langley. She had not made it easy. Helena was not the kind of woman who made anything easy. She was opinionated and independent, and possessed of a stubbornness that matched his own in ways that regularly drove him to the edge of his patience, and then pulled him back from it with a single flash of her rare, unguarded smile. She ran the Langley General Store with her father, Thomas Langley, until Thomas's health had begun to fail 2 years ago, and then she had run it alone, managing accounts and suppliers and the complex social ecosystem of a frontier town's commerce with a competence that Isaac had come to find quietly breathtaking. They had circled each other for 3 years, dancing around something that neither of them had the courage to name properly, settling instead for the comfortable intimacy of daily proximity. Coffee at her counter every morning before he opened the jailhouse. Her voice the last sound he sometimes heard through his window at night when she closed up the store and walked home. Small, fierce arguments about everything from town ordinances to the correct way to treat a horse's injured leg. Moments of accidental tenderness that they both pretended afterward had not meant what they clearly meant. The letter from Denver had arrived like a trap springing shut on everything. "Tell me something," Helena said now, her voice very quiet. She had moved away from his desk and stood with her back half turned, looking out the window at the main street of the town they had both spent 3 years building. "Tell me that you are not already halfway out that door in your head. Tell me the truth, Isaac." "I do not know what I am," Isaac said, and it was the most honest thing he had said all day. She turned then. The afternoon light caught her face in a way that made his chest ache with something too complicated to be called by any simple name. "Then figure it out," she said. "But do not expect me to wait quietly while you decide whether this town, whether I am worth staying for. I have watched you pour yourself into this place for 3 years. I know what you have built here. But I also know that you are the proudest man I have ever met, and that pride is going to tell you that you deserve Denver, and that Denver deserves you, and that leaving is somehow the noble choice. And it is not." She stopped, swallowed. "It is just leaving." She walked out of the jailhouse, and Isaac sat for a long moment in the silence she left behind, staring at the letter with its cracked red seal, and felt the first real cracks appearing in something he had been building inside himself for 3 years. The town council meeting that evening was held in the back room of Haverson's saloon, as all matters of genuine importance in Harlow Creek inevitably were. Frank was the one who had sent the letter of recommendation to Denver. Isaac had not known this until Frank told him tonight, with the kind of gruff, self-satisfied pride that suggested he expected to be thanked. "You have outgrown this town, son," Frank said, settling his large frame into a chair that creaked in protest. "That is not an insult. That is a fact. Denver is where a man of your abilities belongs." "This town is not finished," Isaac said. "It is finished enough," Gerald Barton said, smoothing his jacket. Gerald's kind always said things were finished enough the moment they could no longer personally benefit from the continued effort. "What does Helena Langley say about it?" Reverend Doyle asked, and the quiet precision of the question created a small, charged silence. Isaac looked at the Reverend steadily. "Miss Langley's opinion on my professional decisions is her own affair." Said the Reverend, in the tone of a man who knew considerably more than he was being told. "Isaac," Frank said, leaning forward, "this appointment does not come twice. The marshal's office is not in the habit of asking twice. I know that. And the town will find another sheriff. A decent one, given your training record. Young Harris from the South End has the makings. Deputy Harris is 22 years old and has never faced anything more dangerous than the Whitley brothers drunk on a Saturday night," Isaac said flatly. "He would grow into it," Frank said. "The same way you did." Isaac said nothing. He was looking at the worn surface of the table, at the rings left by 100 glasses of whiskey, at the scratches and nicks of 3 years of hard decisions made in this room. He was thinking about Helena's face in the afternoon light. He was thinking about the word leaving, and the way she had said it like it was its own kind of violence. He went home that night to the small house the town provided for its sheriff, a 3-room structure that he had gradually, almost without noticing, made into something that resembled a home. He sat on the porch in the dark and listened to Harlow Creek settle into its nighttime sounds, the distant laughter from Haversons, the occasional movement of horses, the dry whisper of the desert wind, and he thought about what it meant to be proud of something. His father had been a proud man. The kind of proud that could not bend without breaking, that mistook stubbornness for strength, and called every retreat a defeat. Isaac had spent a long time running from that version of pride, building instead what he thought of as a different kind, a pride rooted in his work, in the standards he held himself to, in the town he had helped shape. But somewhere in the last few hours, he had begun to wonder if he was more his father's son than he had been willing to admit, because there was something in the Denver appointment that fed a hunger he had been ashamed to acknowledge. The recognition, the status, the proof that he was not just a small-town sheriff in a territory that did not yet have statehood. And if he let that hunger make this decision, he was going to lose something that could not be replaced. He did not sleep well. In the morning, he walked to the Langley General Store at his usual time and found it closed, which it never was on a Wednesday. The closed sign hung in the window like a reproach, and Isaac stood on the boardwalk for a long moment before he understood that Helena was telling him something in the only language she had available, the language of absence. He turned and went to the jailhouse and found his deputy, a lean young man named Caleb Harris with sand-colored hair and an earnest expression, cleaning the rifles with the meticulous attention he gave to everything. "Quiet night?" Isaac asked. "Almost," Caleb said, not looking up. "Tom Keller came in wanting to report that someone had moved his fence line. I told him to come back in the morning and you would ride out and look at it. And there was a rider through town around midnight, stranger. He stopped at Haverson's and moved on. Eliza at the bar said he was asking about the town's law arrangements." Isaac's attention sharpened. What did she tell him? She told him there was a sheriff who did not lose, which is what she always tells strangers who ask that kind of question. Good. He sat down at his desk and found himself staring at the space where the Denver letter had been. He had locked it in the desk drawer. He found himself not wanting to look at it again, which told him something. "Can I ask you something?" Caleb said, setting down the rifle he was cleaning and giving Isaac the kind of direct look that suggested he had been composing this question for a while. "You are going to ask it whether I say yes or no," Isaac said. "Are you going to take the Denver job?" "I have not decided. Miss Langley's store is closed this morning." "I noticed." Caleb was quiet for a moment, with the careful neutrality of a young man who understood exactly what he was stepping into and was choosing to step into it anyway. "She has turned down 2 offers from merchants in Santa Fe to buy her out and set her up in a bigger city. She turned them down in the last year. I thought you should know that, in case you were wondering whether she has her own options and she has been choosing to stay." Isaac looked at his deputy for a long moment. "Who told you about those offers?" "Reverend Doyle mentioned it to my mother," Caleb said, without the slightest hint of apology. Isaac stood up, put on his hat, and walked out of the jailhouse into the morning sun. He did not go to Helena's store. He went, instead, to see her father. Thomas Langley lived in the rooms above the general store, a situation that had become permanent as his health declined. He was 61 years old and had the papery fragility of a man whose body had decided it was finished arguing about things, though his mind remained sharply intact. He had come to New Mexico territory with his wife Caroline in 1868, when Helena was 10 years old, following the dream of building something on the frontier that the crowded East had not left room for. Caroline had died of fever in the winter of 1875, leaving Thomas with a 15-year-old daughter and a half-built store and more grief than a person could properly carry without being changed by it. Helena had built the store. That was the truth that the town knew but rarely said plainly. Thomas had provided the vision and the initial capital and a lifetime of mercantile experience. But it was Helena who had turned the Langley General Store into the beating heart of Harlow Creek's commercial life, managing relationships with suppliers as far away as Kansas City, keeping records that the bank manager had once described, with obvious reluctance, as the most accurate accounts he had seen in 15 years of frontier banking. Thomas was sitting in his chair by the window when Isaac knocked and entered, a book open on his lap that he was clearly not reading. "I expected you yesterday," Thomas said, without preamble. "I needed a night to think." "Has thinking helped?" Isaac sat down across from him. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and old wood, and the faint medicinal scent that had become part of Thomas Langley's atmosphere over the last year. Through the floor, Isaac could faintly hear the familiar sounds of the store below, which told him Helena had opened it despite herself. "Sir," Isaac said, "I need to ask you something directly." "Then do it directly," Thomas said, with the faint amusement of a man who had earned the right to dispense with preamble. "Your daughter is the most capable, stubborn, extraordinary woman I have ever met in my life. And I have spent 3 years being too proud and too frightened to tell her properly what that means to me. I am asking you now whether you believe she would be willing to hear it, because I am preparing to make a decision that is going to cost me something, and I want to know whether the thing I am choosing instead is real." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. He looked out the window at the street below, at a section of Harlow Creek that had been raw desert when he had first arrived. "My daughter," Thomas said finally, "closed her store this morning for the first time in 2 years. She woke up at 6 and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table for an hour before she went downstairs and opened the doors, and then about an hour later she closed them again. I heard all of this. These walls are thin." He paused. "She has never done that before. Not once. Not through blizzards or illness, or the time that awful Morrison man tried to undercut her with the cattle ranchers, and she spent 3 weeks fighting him off. She closed the store this morning because she could not stand the idea of you walking in like everything was ordinary when nothing is ordinary. That tells you everything about how real it is, son." Isaac stood up. He shook Thomas Langley's hand. "You had better not leave," Thomas said. "No, sir," Isaac said. "I do not intend to." He went downstairs through the internal door that connected the living quarters to the back of the store, and he found Helena in the storeroom, doing inventory with a focus so fierce and concentrated that it was clearly a performance, because the moment she heard his boots on the floor, she went completely still. "I am not open," she said without turning around. "I know," Isaac said. "I came through the back." She turned then. Her hair had escaped some of its pins, and there was a smudge of chalk on her left hand from whatever she had been counting, and she looked at him with those gray eyes that could measure and weigh everything, and he could see the effort she was making to hold herself steady. "Have you decided?" she asked. "Yes," he said. The words sat between them for a moment. "And," she said with a careful steadiness that he recognized now as courage, "I am going to write to Denver," he said. "I am going to thank them for the appointment and decline it. And then I am going to ask you, Helena, if you would be willing to sit with me for a while and let me tell you some things that I have been a fool not to say for the better part of 3 years." He watched something shift in her face. Not relief, not yet. Something more complex and more honest than simple relief. The careful architecture of self-protection that she had been maintaining for months beginning, carefully, to come apart. "You are declining a senior marshal's appointment," she said. "I am. Because of me." "Because of this town," he said. "And because of you. And because I finally understand the difference between the kind of pride that makes you run toward something bigger and the kind that makes you stay and build something real. And I choose the second kind." He paused. "I choose you." The tears that came to Helena Langley's eyes arrived in absolute silence, and she wiped them away with the back of her chalked hand, leaving a streak of white on her cheek. And then she made a sound that was half laugh and half something rower than that, and she said, "You are the most difficult man I have ever met in my entire life." "I know," Isaac said. "If you had left," she said, and stopped. "I know," he said again, more quietly. She crossed the storeroom and he met her halfway, and when she let him put his arms around her, it was with the kind of surrender that costs something. The kind that only comes when a proud person has decided that another person is worth the vulnerability. He held her for a long moment in the dusty light of the storeroom, surrounded by barrels of flour and bolts of fabric, and the mundane, irreplaceable inventory of an ordinary life. "Tell me the things you have been too foolish to say," she said against his shoulder. "That might take a while," he said. "Good," she said. "I am not going anywhere." They sat in the small office at the back of the store for 2 hours, with the closed sign still in the window and a pot of coffee that neither of them remembered making growing cold on the desk between them. Isaac told her things he had been composing in the back of his mind for 3 years. Things about the morning he had watched her face down Gerald Barton over a contract dispute, and realized that he had never before felt protective of someone who so clearly did not need protection. But he had felt it anyway. About the night of the big storm in the autumn of their first year, when he had seen a light in the store window at 2 in the morning and gone to check it, and found her restacking shelves that the thunder had knocked over, singing quietly to herself, completely self-sufficient and completely alone, and how that image had stayed with him like a wound he could not explain. Helena listened to all of it with her characteristic stillness, the kind that was not passivity but concentration. And then she told him her own things, about the morning she had realized she was watching for his silhouette before he rounded the corner for his daily coffee, about the anger she had felt at herself for it, About the months she had spent convincing herself that a sheriff's life was too uncertain to build anything around. About the 2 offers from Santa Fe that she had declined without quite admitting to herself why. "Why did you not say anything?" he asked. "Why did you not?" she returned, with the ghost of a challenge in her voice. "Fair," he conceded. "I was afraid," she said simply, and for Helena Langley, that admission was the kind of thing that cost as much as it gave. "I watched my mother love this territory and it killed her. I watched my father love this town and it wore him down to something fragile. I have spent my whole life being careful, being self-sufficient, not needing things I could not guarantee." "You cannot guarantee me," Isaac said quietly. "I would never insult you by pretending that is not true." "No," she said. "But I have decided that the risk of having you is less terrifying than the certainty of not." He reached across the desk and took her hand. She looked down at their joined hands with an expression he had never seen on her face before, something unguarded and wondering, like she was examining something she had thought only existed in the stories she had stopped believing when she was 15 and her mother died. He wrote the letter to Denver that afternoon, sitting at his own desk in the jailhouse with the afternoon sun making long rectangles of gold across the floor. He wrote it carefully, respectfully, with the deliberate precision he brought to every official document. He thanked the marshal's office for their confidence in his abilities. He declined the appointment. He sealed the letter and gave it to the post rider without a single moment of second-guessing, and he felt, as the rider disappeared down the main street with his saddlebag, something that it took him a while to identify. He felt free. He felt, for the first time in his life, like a man who had chosen his life rather than fallen into it. The news spread through Harlow Creek in the way that all news spread in a small frontier town, which was to say with remarkable speed and a great deal of embellishment. By dinner time, the version circulating through Haverson's saloon was that Isaac had turned down a personal offer from the governor of Colorado, and that the reason was a very particular young woman who ran the general store. Frank Norris was reportedly furious. Reverend Doyle was reportedly pleased. Gerald Barton had reportedly expressed the opinion that it was a waste, which confirmed to everyone who heard it that it was nothing of the sort. Helena reopened her store the following morning. When Isaac came in for his coffee, she poured it without comment and pushed the cup across the counter with the same matter-of-fact efficiency she always had. But there was a difference in the air between them, now that both of them were aware of and neither of them quite knew how to navigate in the context of counter-transactions, and the monitoring eyes of whatever customer happened to be browsing the shelves. It was Caleb Harris who unwittingly gave them their first genuine social occasion by breaking the back wheel of the jail's supply wagon on a delivery run, and requiring Isaac to spend 2 days negotiating the repair with the town's blacksmith, Elias Crown, a large and amiable man who was also, by happy coincidence, the husband of Helena's closest friend, Ruth Crown. Ruth had organized what she described as a simple supper to celebrate the wagon's repair, and the guest list had expanded to include Isaac and Helena, in what was transparently an act of social engineering that neither of them was in a position to resist without being rude. Ruth Crown's simple suppers were never simple. She was a former schoolteacher from Ohio who had come west with Elias and channeled her considerable organizational intelligence into the social architecture of Harlow Creek with the same systematic thoroughness she had once applied to primary education. The table was set with the good china, the food was complicated and excellent, and Ruth managed the conversation with the subtle expertise of a general directing a campaign, guiding things away from anything too political or too contentious, and toward exactly the terrain she wanted. "Isaac," she said, refilling his glass with water from the clay pitcher, "Helena tells me you have been teaching Caleb Harris some of the legal codes that apply to territorial disputes. He needs to understand the law as well as the gun," Isaac said. "A sheriff who can only resolve things with force has a very short career." "That is a very sophisticated view," Ruth said. "Not all lawmen share it. Most lawmen in this territory learned on the job from other lawmen who learned on the job. The accumulation of bad habits becomes its own tradition," Isaac said. "I would rather Deputy Harris understand why the law works the way it does, not just what the law is." Across the table, Helena was listening with an expression that Isaac was becoming better at reading. Interest, genuine and concentrated, the same attention she brought to things she considered worth understanding. "You read much law?" she asked. "As much as I can get. The circuit judge brings books sometimes. And I write to the courts in Santa Fe occasionally when something comes up that is not covered by the territorial statutes." "You never mentioned that," she said. "You never asked," he said. And they looked at each other for a moment across Ruth's carefully appointed table, with the particular intensity of two people discovering that they have more to learn about each other than they had realized. Elias Crown, a man of few words and great perceptiveness, poured himself more whiskey and said nothing, which was his way of being satisfied with how things were going. The weeks that followed were the most complicated and the most vivid of Isaac's adult life. Harlow Creek was not a town that paused to accommodate anyone's personal business, and the day-to-day work of being its sheriff continued with its usual demands. In October of 1885, with the nights already turning sharp and cold, a situation developed on the eastern edge of the territory that required Isaac's full professional attention, and would, before it resolved itself, bring everything in his personal life into a different and clarifying kind of focus. It began with a man named Dobrescu. George Dobrescu was a land speculator from back east who had come to New Mexico territory 6 months earlier with a letter of credit from a bank in Philadelphia and ambitions that he had never been sufficiently honest about. He had been quietly buying land on the eastern edge of Harlow Creek's territory from ranchers who did not fully understand what they were selling, using a method that involved legal contracts written in language too complex for most frontier families to parse without a lawyer, and then renting the land back to them at rates that were technically legal and practically ruinous. 3 ranching families had come to Isaac in September with versions of the same story. He had listened carefully to each one and spent 2 weeks reading the contracts they brought him, writing twice to the territorial attorney's office in Santa Fe, and gradually assembling a picture of what Dobrescu was doing that was considerably darker than simple sharp dealing. Dobrescu had a partner. This was what Isaac discovered in the 3rd week of October, when one of the ranchers, a quiet man named Samuel Whitfield, came to the jailhouse at dawn with a bruise across his jaw and a story about 2 men who had visited his property the night before with a message from Dobrescu that translated to pay the increased rent or vacate by month's end. The partner's name was Cole Ritter. He was not a land speculator. He was a former enforcer from Kansas who had a history with 3 territorial sheriffs, none of it good, and who had come to New Mexico territory with a specific skill set that Dobrescu was paying to apply to the problem of ranchers who did not understand that they had already lost. Isaac sent a telegram to the Santa Fe marshal's office that afternoon. He received a reply the following morning that was helpful in principle and useless in practice. Yes, Ritter was known to them. No, they did not currently have the personnel to dispatch to Harlow Creek. They had every confidence in Sheriff Ingram's ability to manage the situation. He showed the telegram to Caleb Harris without comment. Caleb read it and said, "So it is just us then." "It usually is," Isaac said. He spent that evening at the Langley General Store, ostensibly to pick up the order of oil lanterns he had requested for the jailhouse, actually because Helena had left a note that morning that said only, "Come for supper if you can. I want to talk about the Whitfield situation." She had, characteristically, been paying attention. She fed him venison stew and cornbread, and laid out what she knew about Dobriscu's movements through the local supply chain. Because, as the proprietor of the main general store, she knew things about a community's commerce that no one else did. She knew that Dobriscu had been placing large supply orders through an intermediary, that his operation was bigger than it appeared on the surface, and that there were at least 2 more families on the Eastern Range who had signed similar contracts and had not yet come to Isaac because they were afraid. "I can contact them," she said. "Mrs. Sullivan from the church circle knows the Hennessy family, and I have supplied the Torres family for years. They trust me. They might talk to me when they would not talk to a badge." Isaac looked at her across the table. "This could become dangerous," he said. "I understand that," she said. "Helena, do not tell me to stay out of it," she said with quiet firmness. "These families are part of this town. Their trouble is this town's trouble, and I am not asking your permission to do what I think is right. I am telling you what I am planning to do so that we can coordinate." He recognized this as both a genuine collaboration and a very pointed statement about the kind of partnership she expected. He respected both. "Be careful about what you say directly," he said. "Dobriscu may have ears. And do not go alone to any of the outlying properties. Take Ruth Crown with you, or come to me first." "Agreed," she said, with the efficient nod of a woman accepting the terms of a reasonable compromise. What followed was the most concentrated week of Isaac's professional life, in 3 years of concentrated professional life. He visited each of the 3 ranching families formally, documented their complaints, and sent the written testimony to Santa Fe with a request for a territorial attorney to review Dobriscu's contracts. He made sure that Dobriscu knew he was being watched, doing it openly and deliberately, because the worst thing he could do with a man like Dobriscu was allow him to feel that he was operating in the dark. Helena, in the meantime, had 2 careful conversations, and what she brought back was the missing piece. The Torres family, Juan and Rosa Torres, who ran a small but productive cattle operation 12 miles east, had not just signed a contract with Dobriscu. They had also, under considerable pressure and without fully understanding the implications, signed a promissory note that gave Dobriscu a claim on their livestock as collateral. It was the kind of document that, if Dobriscu chose to call it in, would wipe them out completely. Isaac rode out to the Torres ranch on a Wednesday with the documentation. Helena had helped him assemble, and spent 3 hours sitting at their kitchen table with Juan and Rosa, and a copy of territorial land law explaining exactly what had been done to them and exactly what could be done about it. Rosa Torres cried quietly at one point, and Juan Torres looked at Isaac with an expression of such dignified, furious gratitude that Isaac felt it like a physical thing. He filed the formal complaint with the territorial attorney's office the following day. He also sent a personal letter to Judge Hargrove, the circuit judge who rode through Harlow Creek 4 times a year, explaining the situation and requesting an emergency review. Cole Ritter came to Harlow Creek on a Thursday night. Isaac was aware of his arrival within 20 minutes of the man's horse reaching the hitching rail outside Haverson's saloon, because Caleb Harris had been watching the Eastern Road since Monday, under orders to report any unfamiliar riders immediately and from a distance. Ritter was a large man, wide through the shoulders, with the deliberate ease of movement that Isaac had learned to recognize as the opposite of innocence. He had come alone, which was either confidence or an oversight, and he settled at the bar at Haverson's with a glass of whiskey and the contained patience of a man waiting to be noticed. Isaac let him wait. He finished his supper, wrote 2 letters, checked on the jail's single current occupant, a cattle drover sleeping off a misunderstanding, and then walked across the street to Haverson's at 8 o'clock in the evening with his badge visible and his expression neutral. He sat down at the bar 1 stool from Ritter and ordered coffee. "You the sheriff?" Ritter asked, without looking at him. "That is usually what the badge means," Isaac said. Ritter turned to look at him then, and Isaac returned the examination steadily. There was a calculation in the man's eyes, the professional assessment of another professional, and Isaac let him calculate. "I have heard things about this town," Ritter said. "People generally have," Isaac said. "Things about a sheriff who does not lose." "People have been known to exaggerate," Isaac said, "though not always." Ritter finished his whiskey. He set the glass down with a deliberate care that was its own kind of message. "Mr. Dobrescu has business interests in this territory that are legally documented." "Mr. Dobrescu's legal documents are currently under review by the Territorial Attorney's Office in Santa Fe," Isaac said pleasantly. As Mr. Dobrescu was notified by official communication 3 days ago, something flickered in Ritter's eyes. He had not known that. "Additionally," Isaac said, "the promissory note signed by Juan and Rosa Torres has been reviewed by 2 legal consultants and found to contain language that does not comply with territorial regulations for collateral agreements. That review will also be submitted to the court." The silence was careful and considered. "You have been busy," Ritter said. "It is a busy town," Isaac said. Ritter left Harlow Creek the following morning, riding east in the early light. Isaac watched him go from the jailhouse porch and felt the particular satisfaction of a threat that had been met without violence, which was always his preference when it was available. 3 weeks later, the Territorial Attorney's Office sent a formal notice of investigation to George Dobrescu. 6 weeks after that, Dobrescu settled with all 5 affected families, returning the land deeds and voiding the promissory note, in exchange for the complaints being formally dropped. He left the territory in December and did not return. It was not a perfect resolution. Nothing ever was. But it was real and it was lasting, and the Torres family sent Isaac a bottle of wine at Christmas that he had never had, and could not quite identify but drank anyway, alone on his porch in the cold, looking at the stars over the desert with a feeling that was quiet and clear and good. He was not alone on the porch for long. He had sent a note to Helena telling her about the settlement, and she had appeared at his door 20 minutes later, wrapped in a heavy wool coat and carrying a plate of the ginger snaps she made every December, which he was absolutely not going to tell anyone were his favorite food in the world. "Sit with me," he said. She sat. They passed the plate of ginger snaps between them in the cold and looked at the desert sky, which in the December dark was an absolute excess of stars. And Isaac thought about what it meant to have chosen this life, this place. This woman sitting beside him with her capable hands wrapped around the warm tin of her plate, and her breath making small clouds in the cold air. "You did something important," she said. "We did," he said. "You found the missing piece. Without the Torah's information, I could not have made the case strong enough." She considered this. "We work well together," she said, with the slightly cautious tone of someone acknowledging something large by describing something small. "We do," he agreed. The stars were extraordinary, and the desert was cold, and the town around them was quiet and alive. And Isaac Ingram sat on his porch on a December night in 1885 and understood, with the kind of certainty that comes only when you stop running from it, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He also understood that he needed to ask Helena Langley a question that he had been composing in his head in various drafts for approximately 3 months, and that if he waited any longer, he was going to spend the rest of his life regretting it. He turned to look at her. She was already looking at him, with those gray eyes that measured everything. And for once, she was not measuring him but simply looking, with something open and steady in her expression that he had not seen there before their conversation in the storeroom, and that had been growing ever since. "Helena," he said. "Yes," she said, not answering a question he had not yet asked, just filling the space between them with the word like an acknowledgement. "I have been thinking about the future," he said. "So have I," she said. "I would like, if you are willing, to think about it together." Formally. She looked at him for a long moment. The corners of her mouth moved. "Is that how you ask a woman to marry you?" she said. "By suggesting you might think about the future together." "I am working up to it," he said. "Work faster," she said. "It is cold," he laughed. It was the uncomplicated, genuine kind of laugh that he rarely allowed himself, and that always, when it happened, surprised him. "Helena Marie Langley," he said, and turned fully toward her on the porch with the December stars overhead and the desert wind moving through the sage brush. "I am in love with you. I have been in love with you for 3 years, and I was too proud and too afraid to say it properly until very recently. And I am done being either of those things. I want to marry you. I want to build something with you that is more than what either of us has built alone. I want your stubbornness and your opinions and your extraordinary accounts ledger and your gray eyes and your ginger snaps and every argument we are ever going to have, and I want them to be mine, and I want to be yours. That is what I am asking." Helena Langley looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, you impossible man." He kissed her then for the first time, on his porch in the December cold. And it was neither dramatic nor particularly graceful, because they were both sitting at an awkward angle and the plate of ginger snaps was in the way. But it was real, and it was warm, and it was the single best thing that had happened to Isaac Ingram in 31 years of living. They told her father the following morning. Thomas Langley sat in his chair by the window and looked at Isaac with an expression that managed to be simultaneously surprised, unsurprised, relieved, and mildly emotional, and he said, "Good." Finally. And then he told Isaac that if he did not make his daughter happy, he would haunt him, which he managed to deliver with enough dry humor that it did not entirely sound like a threat. They told Reverend Doyle that afternoon, who immediately began scheduling and had to be gently redirected by Helena, who had firm views about the pace of things, and was not going to be rushed into a wedding by a reverend with a calendar. They told Ruth Crown, who burst into tears immediately, which alarmed Isaac considerably until she reassured him that they were good tears. And then she began planning a celebration supper that, everyone in Harlow Creek privately suspected, had been half prepared since sometime in October. Caleb Harris, when told, shook Isaac's hand with both of his and said, "That is the best news this jailhouse has ever had, sir," and then went back to cleaning the rifles with more enthusiasm than they required. Frank Norris sent a congratulatory note that was perfectly gracious, and only slightly tinged with the lingering residue of his opinion that Denver would have been a better choice. Isaac appreciated the effort. The wedding was planned for March of 1886, which gave the desert time to move past the worst of the winter cold and the wildflowers, which bloomed briefly and brilliantly on the hills east of Harlow Creek in early spring, time to appear. Helena had very specific ideas about the flowers, which was the one area of the wedding planning where her practical nature gave way to something more aesthetic, and she would not be argued with about the timing. Isaac had no objections. The months between December and March were, for both of them, a revelation in the particular experience of being known. Having spent 3 years in careful proximity, they were in many ways already familiar with each other's rhythms. But the difference between knowing someone and having chosen them was something that neither of them had understood before, and they discovered it in small, continuous ways. The particular ease of sitting in the same room without requiring conversation. The way that difficult days became less difficult when there was a person who understood what had made them hard. The arguments, which were genuine and vigorous and always, in the end, productive, because they were between two people who respected each other too much to be dishonest. They argued in January about where they would live. Isaac's sheriff's house was provided by the town and was appropriate for a single man. Helena's rooms above the store were the practical choice, but Thomas Langley lived there too, and the arrangement would be complicated. They went back and forth on it for 2 weeks, drafting and discarding several compromises, until Reverend Doyle mentioned in passing that the house on the north side of Elm Street, the largest private dwelling in Harlow Creek, had become available because the banker who owned it had moved to Albuquerque. It was too large, in Helena's immediate opinion. Isaac pointed out that large houses could be filled by other means over time, and the look Helena gave him in response to that was composed of approximately equal parts amusement, color, and an absolute refusal to acknowledge that she was pleased. They bought the house. They were married on a Saturday in March 1886, the day before the spring wildflowers peaked on the eastern hills, which Helena considered acceptable timing. Reverend Doyle performed the ceremony in the church that Isaac had helped repair twice, and that Helena had supplied since her father opened the store. The whole town came, which was the only possible social outcome in Harlow Creek, where everyone's business was everyone's business, and the business of the sheriff marrying the storekeeper was the most interesting thing that had happened since the Dobrescu situation. Helena wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from a supplier in San Francisco 6 weeks earlier, a deep blue that matched nothing in the current frontier fashion and everything about her personal aesthetic, which had never particularly cared about current frontier fashion. She wore her hair up with the practical pins she always used, plus 2 small wildflowers from the eastern hills that Ruth Crown had gathered that morning, and pressed on her with the cheerful force of someone who had been planning this detail for months. Isaac wore his good suit and had cleaned his boots with a thoroughness that Caleb Harris had observed and carefully refrained from commenting on. When Helena walked down the aisle of the church on her father's arm, Thomas Langley moving carefully and slowly on his cane with a dignity that cost him something, and that he paid without visible complaint, Isaac watched her come toward him and felt a stillness settle through him that he had never experienced before. Not the stillness of waiting, of holding his breath for something he was afraid to want, but the stillness of arrival, of a man reaching the place he has been, without quite knowing it, making his way toward for a long time. She reached him and looked at him with those gray eyes and said, very quietly so that only he could hear it, "Stop looking at me like that. You are going to make me cry in front of the whole town." "Would that be so terrible?" he said, equally quiet. "Catastrophically," she said. And then, because she was Helena, she smiled with the full genuine warmth that she did not often allow herself in public, the smile that he had been quietly collecting examples of for 3 years, and it was better than any smile he had ever catalogued in his memory. The year that followed their wedding was the year that Harlow Creek became something that none of them had precisely planned for it to become. It was partly Isaac's doing, and partly Helena's, and partly the simple, cumulative weight of years of good decisions made by people who genuinely cared about the place they lived in. The town incorporated formally in the spring of 1886, achieving recognition as an official municipality of New Mexico Territory, a process that required a great deal of paperwork and 2 trips by Isaac to Santa Fe that he did not particularly enjoy. The incorporation meant a formal town charter, which meant a real mayor and a real council with legal standing, and the election of the first mayor of Harlow Creek was contested but not contentious, resulting in the somewhat surprising but widely approved choice of Frank Norris, who, to everyone's relief, proved more capable at civic administration than at personnel management. Isaac remained sheriff, now with a formal municipal mandate rather than a council appointment. The salary was better. The authority was clearer. The work was substantially the same, but the legal footing was firmer, and he had been wanting firm legal footing for 3 years. Helena, in the meantime, had begun doing something she had been thinking about quietly for months. She started running what she called a trading information service, which was essentially a formalized version of what she had always done naturally, gathering and organizing commercial intelligence about prices, suppliers, and transport routes from her contacts across the territory, and sharing it with other small businesses in Harlow Creek and the surrounding area. What this meant in practice was that the merchants and ranchers within 50 miles of Harlow Creek gradually stopped being at the mercy of middlemen who controlled their information access, and started making better decisions with better information, which was good for them and, ultimately, good for the entire regional economy. It was not a simple or an obvious thing. It required Helena to write dozens of letters a month and to develop a kind of organized credibility that women in the frontier West were not automatically accorded. She had to fight for it, quietly and consistently, in the way she fought for everything, with evidence and patience and the particular force of someone who is entirely right and knows it. Isaac watched her do this with a pride that he did not always express clearly, but that she seemed to understand anyway, in the way that they were increasingly understanding things about each other without requiring explicit statement. In the autumn of 1886, Helena told him she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen of the North Elm Street house on a Tuesday morning while he was eating breakfast, sitting across from him, with her hands folded on the table, and her gray eyes watching his face with the concentrated attention of a woman who was trying to measure his reaction exactly. He put down his fork. He looked at her. He felt something move through him that he could not name precisely, something that was simultaneously enormous and quiet, like the feeling of watching the sun come up over the desert horizon from very high up, where you could see the full expanse of what was being illuminated. "You are certain," he said. "I am not given to uncertainty," she said, which was so perfectly accurate that he almost laughed. He got up from his chair and came around the table and crouched beside her chair so that he was level with her, taking both her hands in his, and he looked at her face, which was composed and clear and carefully not expressing the full weight of what was behind her eyes. "Helena," he said. "Yes," she said. "Are you frightened?" She considered this with her characteristic honesty. "Somewhat," she said. "Yes, so am I," he said. "Completely, and also," he stopped, finding that the rest of the sentence was too large for words. "I know," she said, and she did. Their son was born in the summer of 1887, in the North Elm Street house, attended by Dr. Margaret Chen, the physician who had arrived in Harlow Creek the previous year from San Francisco, a woman of considerable competence and minimal patience for unnecessary drama. The birth was difficult in the early stages and fine in the final stages, and Isaac, who had maintained careful composure through a great deal of professionally dangerous situations, had spent 2 hours pacing the downstairs hall with his hands clasped behind his back, in a state of barely contained terror that Caleb Harris, who had come to sit with him, would never fully describe to anyone who asked. Thomas Langley, who had been brought from his rooms above the store by Helena's insistence, sat in the parlor in the large chair they had moved downstairs for him, and slept through the second hour and woke for the sound of the baby. The baby was a boy. He had Isaac's dark coloring and Helena's eyes, or at least Helena declared they were her eyes, and Isaac was in no condition to argue about anything. They named him Thomas William Ingram, Thomas for his grandfather, William for no particular reason except that Helena said it suited him, and she was characteristically correct. Thomas Langley held his grandson in the parlor of the North Elm Street house on a summer afternoon, and looked at him with an expression that Isaac could not bear to watch for long because it was made entirely of emotion. And then he looked up at his daughter and then at his son-in-law and said, with remarkable steadiness, "This is good." It was good. Thomas Langley died the following winter, in the February of 1888, quietly and without excessive suffering, in his own rooms above the store with Helena beside him and the town of Harlow Creek, going about its ordinary business in the street below, which was what he would have wanted. He left the store to Helena outright, with a letter that she read once and then folded and kept in the desk in the back office, and that Isaac never asked her to show him because it was hers. She grieved in the private, thorough way that she did everything, allowing herself the full weight of it without self-pity and without the kind of performed stoicism that refuses to acknowledge what has been lost. Isaac learned in those weeks what it meant to be present for someone's grief in a way that was genuinely helpful, which was not about resolving anything or making it better, but simply about being entirely and consistently there, in the same room, with the same steadiness, until the worst of it had passed. She came through it. She always came through things. In the spring of 1888, a rider from Santa Fe brought Isaac a letter that he read twice before telling Helena about it. The marshal's office was not asking him to come to Denver this time. They were asking something different. He brought the letter home and gave it to Helena at the kitchen table. She read it carefully. She read it a second time. She set it down and looked at him. "This one is different," she said. "It is," he said. "You would not have to leave." "Correct." "It is an important role," she said, and he could hear her thinking through it with the same systematic intelligence she brought to every significant decision. "It would affect how the law is practiced across a very large area." "Yes, and you would be in Harlow Creek." "The position requires periodic travel to Santa Fe," he said, "and to various locations across the territory. But yes, home base would be Harlow Creek." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the letter with those gray eyes that missed nothing. "You want it," she said. "I want to know what you think," he said. "I think," she said carefully, "that the work you do here matters enormously. And I think the work you could do in this role would matter more widely. And I think," she stopped, looked at him with something unguarded in her expression, "I think you are the right person for it. And I think there is a version of pride that is not about fear and not about running, but just about being honest about what you are good at and letting yourself do it. And I think this might be that version." He looked at her for a long moment across the kitchen table where they had eaten breakfast and argued and planned and been simply together for 2 years, with their son's sounds filtering down from the room above. "I think you might be right," he said. "I usually am," she said. And the corner of her mouth moved in the precise way that he had spent 3 years cataloging. He accepted the position. The role of Deputy Superintendent of Southern Territorial Law Enforcement was not glamorous in the way that Denver might have been. It was paperwork and policy, and the occasional, very long ride to a jurisdiction where things had gone wrong in ways that required the kind of authority and institutional knowledge that Isaac had spent 7 years accumulating. It was the work of building systems that would outlast any individual sheriff, of establishing standards for training and conduct and legal procedure that would make the whole territory's law enforcement more reliable and more just. It was exactly the right work. He understood that the moment he began it. Caleb Harris became the full sheriff of Harlow Creek in the autumn of 1888, when Isaac's new responsibilities required him to step back from the day-to-day duties of the position. Isaac had been training him for 2 years, deliberately and systematically, and the appointment was not a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention. Caleb accepted it with the particular combination of seriousness and genuine pleasure of a young man who had been preparing for something and was finally being asked to do it. Isaac kept an office in the jailhouse that Caleb generously maintained for him, and he used it whenever he was in Harlow Creek, which was most of the time. The arrangement worked. The work got done. Harlow Creek remained exactly what it had always been under his watch, a town that took care of its people and its law with equal seriousness. Helena, in the meantime, had expanded the store. Not physically, not yet, but in scope. The Trading Information Service had grown into something with a small staff of 2. A young woman named Clara who had a gift for correspondence, and Mrs. Garcia from the eastern side of town, who knew the Spanish-speaking ranching families, with a depth and personal trust that Helena had been able to cultivate through her, but could not have generated alone. Together, they were providing a service to merchants and ranchers across a territory-wide area that was genuinely improving people's commercial outcomes. And Helena had begun to think about whether it could be formalized into something more structured. She talked about it at the kitchen table in the evenings, with Isaac across from her and young Thomas playing on the floor between them with the carved wooden horse that Elias Crown had made him for his first birthday. "I am thinking about incorporating it," she said one evening in 1889, spreading a hand-drawn diagram across the table. "Not just as a service I run alongside the store, but as a separate enterprise, the Commercial Information Bureau of Southern New Mexico." Isaac looked at the diagram. It was meticulously organized as everything Helena produced was. "That is an ambitious name." "It is an accurate name," she said. "What would it need to function properly? Capital, primarily. A reliable postal system, which we nearly have. Relationships with 2 or 3 key suppliers in Kansas City, and one in Denver who can provide market information." She paused. "And the continued willingness of the men of this territory to take information from a woman seriously, which requires ongoing negotiation." "I have some thoughts on that last one," Isaac said. "I am sure you do," she said, "and I appreciate them. But I have been negotiating that particular obstacle my entire adult life, and I have a better methodology than you do." "I do not doubt it," he said sincerely. The Bureau, as it came to be known throughout the territory, was incorporated in the spring of 1890. Helena ran it with the same systematic intelligence she had always applied to the store, and it grew steadily through the first years of the new decade, becoming a genuine institution of territorial commerce. It was the kind of thing that would not be written about in the newspapers that covered the flashy events of the frontier West, the gunfights and the outlaws and the cattle drives and the land rushes. But it was real, and it was lasting, and the ranchers and merchants who used it, many of whom had been operating at the mercy of middlemen and information asymmetry for their entire careers, felt its impact in their livelihoods in ways that were specific and concrete. Isaac, in his new role, spent a great deal of his time fighting battles that were less visible but equally important. The territorial legislature in Santa Fe was a complicated place, full of competing interests and the kind of political maneuvering that was different in texture but not in substance from the dynamics he had navigated in Harlow Creek for years. He learned its rhythms. He built relationships with the legislators who cared about justice and managed the ones who did not. He pushed, consistently and persistently, for improvements to the territorial law enforcement code that would make it harder for men like Dobrescu to operate and easier for sheriffs like Caleb Harris to protect the people in their jurisdiction. He did not win everything. The pace of legislative change was frustratingly slow, and some of the battles he engaged in most seriously were lost or stalled or sent back for revision in ways that required years of sustained effort. But he was patient. He had always been patient in the end, which was perhaps the quality that most distinguished him from the frontier lawmen of the dime novels, who were always decisive and always quick and always right. Isaac was deliberate. He was thorough. He was sometimes wrong and always willing to revise when he understood why. In the winter of 1890, Helena told him she was pregnant again. This time she told him at the breakfast table with slightly less ceremony, because she was a woman who had done this once before and had some sense of how it went. And also because Thomas, now 3 years old, was conducting a vigorous argument with his wooden horse at the other end of the table, and the general atmosphere was less conducive to drama. "Again," he said, with a smile he could not prevent. "Again," she confirmed with the same smile. "Are you going to crouch beside my chair this time too, or have you outgrown that?" "I might," he said. He did, in fact, briefly crouch beside her chair, which made her laugh in the quiet, genuine way that she had allowed him to hear more and more over the years. Their second child was a daughter, born in the summer of 1891, and they named her Caroline after Helena's mother and called her Carrie from the beginning because Thomas, 4 years old now, could not manage the full name and the shortened version stuck. She had Isaac's focused intensity and Helena's coloring, which was the reverse of Thomas, and she was from the very beginning a child who examined everything around her with a seriousness that made adults feel oddly accountable. Isaac held his daughter in the North Elm Street house on a summer evening, with the desert light golden through the window, and Thomas sitting beside him on the couch with the concentrated proprietary interest of a firstborn child assessing the newcomer. And he thought about his father, who had been a man who could not bend, and about the ways in which children require you to bend continuously, and about the fact that bending was not, as he had once feared, the same as breaking. Ruth Crown, who had been present for the birth with Dr. Chen and who had afterwards celebrated in her kitchen with Elias until quite late, told everyone in Harlow Creek that the Ingram household was the happiest house in the territory, which was the kind of statement that embarrassed Isaac when he heard it, and that Helena received with a slight color in her cheeks that she would have denied if accused. The years that followed were full. The fullness was not the frantic, anxious kind, not the fullness of a life that fears stillness, but the solid, accumulating kind of a life that has found its shape and is living it with intention. There were difficult periods and easy ones. There was the summer of 1892, when a drought across the southern range hit the ranching families hard, and Isaac spent 3 months working with the territorial government on emergency relief measures, while Helena's bureau provided crucial information about supply routes and pricing that helped mitigate the worst of the market disruptions. There was the winter of 1893, when Caleb Harris was shot in the shoulder by a cattle thief who did not know when to stop, and Isaac rode 90 miles in 2 days to be with him. And Caleb recovered. And Isaac spent the first day of his return in the kitchen with Helena at midnight drinking coffee, and not saying very much but needing to be in the same room with her in the particular way of a man who has been reminded of all the ways that things can be taken away. He sent Helena a telegram from Santa Fe that read, "Presented to committee. Well received. Home Thursday. Tell Thomas his horse had better be where he left it." And Helena sent one back that read, "Committee was fortunate. Horse is fine. Thomas is insufferable about it. Come home." He came home. In the summer of 1895, the Ingram family acquired a dog, which was not a significant event in the history of the frontier West, but was a significant event in the history of the North Elm Street house, where Thomas, now 8, had been conducting a sustained campaign for a dog's presence for approximately 2 years. The dog was a large, sandy-colored hound of indeterminate heritage named, at Thomas's insistence, Marshall, which Isaac found either charming or mortifying depending on his mood. Carrie, 4 years old and deeply serious, accepted the dog's presence with the air of one who is extending a provisional tolerance pending further evidence of worthiness. The dog proved worthy. On an evening in the early autumn of 1895, Isaac sat on the porch of the North Elm Street house as the sun went down over the desert, with Marshall asleep across his feet and the sounds of the household settling around him. Helena's voice talking to Thomas about something inside, Carrie's quieter contribution to the conversation, the creak of the house in the evening wind, the distant sounds of Harlow Creek going about its evening business. He was 41 years old, 10 years removed from the stagecoach platform, and the saddlebag and the raw beginning, and the life that had grown up around him was so precisely, specifically right that he sometimes still caught himself being surprised by it, the way you can be surprised by something you have chosen and chosen well. Helena came out onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside him, handing him one, tucking her feet beneath her on the bench in the way she had when she was comfortable. She looked at the desert, at the colors going gold and then rose, and then the deep purple that preceded the first stars. "Thomas asked me today if you were the most important lawman in the territory," she said. "What did you tell him?" Isaac said. "I told him that you were the best one," she said, "which is a different thing." He looked at her. She was 37 years old, and she was exactly herself as she had always been, the same gray eyes and the same ink on her fingers and the same precise, considered way of inhabiting the world, and he was still, daily, struck by the specific gift of her. "Helena," he said. "Isaac," she said, in the tone she used when she knew he was going to say something that did not require a preamble. "I would decline Denver every day," he said. "I want you to know that." She looked at him. Something in her expression was very still and very warm. "I know," she said. "I want to say it anyway," he said. "Occasionally." "Then say it occasionally," she said. "I do not mind." Isaac thought about the letter with the cracked red seal that had landed on his desk in the jailhouse 10 years ago, and about the sound of Helena saying the word, leaving like it was its own kind of violence, and about the conversation in the storeroom and the December porch, and all the ordinary, irreplaceable accumulation of years that had come after. He thought about pride and what it meant, and about the difference between the kind that took you away from things and the kind that asked you to stay and be worth staying for. He was a proud man. He had always been a proud man. But he had learned, here in this town, beside this woman, that the truest pride was not the kind that needed proving. That was the pride worth having, and he had it. He had all of it. "Tell me something," Helena said in the quiet. "What?" he said. "Something you have been too proud to say recently," she said, with the ghost of the old challenge in her voice. He tightened his arm around her. He looked at the stars. "That you are the best thing that ever happened to this town," he said, "and to me, and that I am grateful every single day that I was not too foolish to see it before it was too late." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said very quietly, "That is not too proud. That is just true." "Yes," he said. "Isaac," she said. "Yes," he said. "I love you," she said simply with the directness that was entirely perfectly her. "I know," he said. "Say it back properly," she said. "I love you, Helena," he said. "Obviously, completely, every day." She made a sound against his shoulder that was half satisfaction and half amusement, and the stars overhead were abundant, and the desert was ancient, and the town of Harlow Creek was alive around them in all its ordinary, irreplaceable reality. And that was everything. That was all of it. That was the whole of the life they had chosen, the life that had been, in the end, exactly worth choosing. The lamp in the window of the North Elm Street house burned long into the night, as it always did, visible from the main street of Harlow Creek to anyone who happened to look. And Marshall slept on, heavy across the sheriff's feet, and the desert stars wheeled overhead in their ancient, indifferent beauty. And the town that two people had spent their best years building settled quietly into another night of its good and ongoing life.